It's indeed a great honor and a pleasure for me to introduce this evening, this evening in Europe, managing partner and architect of OMA, headquartered in Rotterdam, David Gianotten. My name is Tom Verabas, professor of architecture in the School of Architecture and Design at NYIT. Firstly, before introducing David Gianotten, I'd like to warmly thank Dean Maria Perbellini for her support for this series of presentations and interviews titled Beyond the Envelope. Many thanks to Professor David Diamond, director of our Master of Architecture program here at New York Tech, for enabling a third year of my MArch graduate seminar course, Beyond the Envelope, within which this seminar series is set, within the presentation series is set. The series of presentations and interviews could never be launched without the important work of our Lectures and Events Committee, especially Athena Papadopoulou, Alessandra Mellis, and the invaluable administrative support of Susan Sternberg. David Gianotten is the managing partner architect of OMA. He oversees the overall organizational and financial management, business strategy, and portfolio. David currently leads the design and construction of projects in different regions, including Amsterdam's Bijenkorf, the conversion of a large 1960s prison complex to a new neighborhood with 1,300 apartments, and VDMA, the transformation of an unused site with industrial heritage in Eindhoven into a mixed-use urban hub. He's led the Taipei Performing Arts Center project since the completion phase in 2008 until building completion in 2022. He is also responsible for the design and realization of Potato Head Studios, a resort in Bali completed in 2020, WA Museum Bula Bartib in Perth, Australia, 2020, Prince Plaza in Shenzhen, 2020, the White Cube in Lusanga, Democratic Republic of Congo in 2018, and the Shenzhen Stock Exchange headquarters completed in 2013. David joined OMA in 2008, launched OMA's Hong Kong office in 2009, and became partner in 2010. He led OMA's portfolio in the Asia-Pacific region for 7 years. Perhaps one of the most talked about buildings of the 21st century, the CCTV Headquarters in Beijing, designed by OMA, is an alternative to the exhaustive typology of the skyscraper. Conceived as a loop with a 75-meter cantilever, the building offers a three-dimensional experience. Visible from most of Beijing, CCTV has been a landmark of the city since its completion in 2012. In this evening's presentation, OMA's managing partner architect, David Gianotten, will explain the relationship between the architectural form of the building and CCTV's unique program of TV making. He will discuss the building's innovative structure and how the self-supporting hybrid facade is a visual manifestation of it. David's lecture will highlight that despite the CCTV headquarters' distinctive form, the architecture is indeed contextual and relevant to the city. In my terms, the CCTV broke many rules and expectations: cultural, formal, contextual, technological, statutory, and regulatory. Due to the unfamiliarity of its form and presence, this is an architecture which demonstrates how architectural form can be read and perceived as a provocation, and how form can ultimately serve as a political tool for architecture. CCTV reminds us of the power of architecture to create meaning as a landmark, but also having the power to arouse strong opinions and ultimately to impact upon culture and society. In his presentation, David Gianotten will relate the CCTV headquarters to OMA's wider portfolio of work and share thoughts about what makes a design innovative and contextual. Lastly, from me, just a few words on the context and format of the series of presentation interviews, Beyond the Envelope. The events are set within a third offering of a one-semester graduate seminar I teach here in the Master of Architecture program at New York Tech. Students critically analyze a series of seminal recent built architectural projects with a focus on the architectural skin, its technologies, and the agency to create architectural effects and affects. By the end of this series, we'll have compiled an edited archive of a total of 21 analyzed projects and 21 interviews with their architects. The outcome of this endeavor will be a published book with Oro Publishers in 2024. The format of these events is a brief presentation by the architect, focusing primarily on the project in question, followed by a student-led interview. I'm pleased to introduce Master of Architecture students, in their final year, Anthony Dolto and Vincenzo Orlogia, who will conduct this interview with David Gianotten following his presentation. Join me please to welcome to New York Tech, David Gianotten, Managing Partner, Architect of OMA.
Hello, Tom. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm joining you from Turin in Italy, where I'm currently for a project that we're doing here. So I'll try to share my screen, but it says that the host disabled screen sharing. So I have to ask you to enable me to do that.
I have enabled you as a co-host. Let me just try again.
Okay.
No,
I'm trying to share.
Good.
Now I need to go to presentation mode. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
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 Okay. Good. So I will focus on the CCTV project in Beijing, which obviously is already quite long completed, and I will go back a bit in the history of time. I only started working on CCTV in 2008, while the competition of the project was in 2002. But before I go into the project, I first would like to quickly also introduce myself. I work for a company called OMA, Office for Metropolitan Architecture, headquartered in the Netherlands, but having offices all around the world. Please don't refer to us as OMA, because if you refer like that in our language, that means grandmother, which is maybe not the right term. My name is David. I work for OMA since 2008, and I've had before my own office in Amsterdam called Church. I'm also a professor at the Technical University in Eindhoven, and I specialize in transformational architecture, any project where there is an existing context that needs to be transformed into a new future. OMA is an architecture office, and CCTV, as you see here in the picture, is one of our important outputs as architects. But next to architecture, we strongly believe that architects have a role to play in society that goes beyond the physical built form. And therefore, we have in our office also our mirror image called AMO, which is a think tank. And we more or less do everything that we think is relevant for the future of the world. And for example, one of the things was the Countryside exhibition in New York recently in the Guggenheim Museum, but also currently we're working on the energy grid for Europe to translate the Green Deal that Europe made to become a sustainable continent. And we're translating that into real proposals, physically and imaginary, inspirational. We have projects all around the world, all different typologies, which makes us very different to many architectural big offices, because we don't focus on one or two or three typologies, but we select our project based on relevance and based on the role that we can play. As said, we always operate there where our clients are, or at least as close as possible. So our headquarters is not an ivory tower where we come up with all kinds of things and then we send it all over the world. No, we actually are on the ground to understand the context. And because of that, we have offices in all segments of the world to also really be able to understand the context, which is always the part that we start operating from. And we want to have intricate knowledge for. So very often our project takes a long time before we come up with a proposal, but we first do a lot of research analysis and also understanding the client and the client's needs. One of the crucial things for architects these days is that we're very often asked to create an unbelievable, impactful or iconic building, as many people say, and it needs therefore always be the greatest possible. Clients, secondly, always say it needs to be there extremely fast, and please prefer to not spend too much money on it. And if you overload these things, you get, of course, this impossible utopia where we always try to operate towards. CCTV is an example of such. When the competition started, there was actually a choice to do the competition for the rebuilding of the Twin Towers in New York, or to focus on the CCTV building. Both projects debated widely worldwide, and obviously both also with a difficult dilemma for an architect, namely a place which got damaged significantly and became a scar in the city. How do you repair it? And other sides, how do you work within a context of China, an upcoming state with a different type of regime, with different type of openness and rules, how to operate? How do you build for that context and building for TV making that also sometimes is seen as a control mechanism of the regime? However, we noticed at the time a very significant change in the openness of the regime and also in the openness of the country, where information became very valuable and didn't only got blocked or controlled, but it also became a means of transcending and communicating with the rest of the world. I will say something later on in my lecture about that too. And we saw this as an opportunity to contribute to a new phase of the Republic, and potentially also to bring some change in the process of information sharing through a physical contribution to it. This is the site before it was transformed. It was a factory site with some housing estates around it. In many publications, it's said that we destroyed hutongs, traditional living areas, for building it. But here you can see yourself that that is definitely not the case. It was an area that had an industrial edge and at the same time a housing component to it, which we had to transform into a compound for media that was part of the city landscape. The CCTV company was located outside of the city in a compound that could not be reached, and it was a bold move to put it into the center of the city, on the ring road, the third ring road, and to really transcend from here, we're giving you the information. It was also in that sense related to the Olympics, to also make that statement to the rest of the world. This was the master plan we were given, and obviously you see here in the red square that the idea was to build a skyscraper, and preferable a very high skyscraper, which gave the company of CCTV kind of a real identity in the world of high rises. And obviously the idea of the high rise is simply a vertical idea, a way of communicating a rise, or communicating a kind of a position, a token position. And we thought that that would not be the right answer here. We thought we had to really be three-dimensional and introduce the loop to the building, simply because the process of information and media making is a loop process. You start with an idea, then you go towards production, you go towards execution, recording, and then of course post-production, and then broadcasting, and then back into the cycle again. So we really use the metaphor of the process of media and information for the metaphor of the building. It also gave us the opportunity to design a building that would be endless, you could say, and therefore you could argue it would always be the highest or the longest, or whatever you would want to give as an idea to it. And here you then also see the inside of that building, something not many people often see, because you see the striking outside and its striking presence of the loop. But here you see how these elements are really connected also in the process of TV making. With at its base studios, production studios, and also recording studios. Also on the top, a specialty for connection to the city, and I will show you an image later from the news that is kind of broadcasted from there. And then alongside it, all the offices and parts related to idea making, production, etc., etc. It's about 1 million square meters, so it's kind of quite large in surface, although it is not the highest building kind of in the Asian context. It fits very clearly within the top 10 even on that aspect. The CCTV building is a complex that goes beyond the loop-shaped building that many people know. There's also the TVCC building where people are hosted, or where there's a hotel located, and where the main large studio is. There's a service building where all the broadcast trucks and people that go beyond the site to gather information, come back and dock back in to share that information. And then there's a huge parking ground. As I said already before, it's about 1 million square meters in total. The parking is hidden underneath a park that became part of the overall idea of the compound. So to also give public space to the city and to also kind of create a platform where people could interact. There's another component to that that I will explain later, and that's a public loop that starts from the park through the building, so that people could also engage and interact with the process of TV making and understand how that actually evolves, making the institution a little bit open to an engagement with the public. Here we see the figure ground, and you then immediately see that although there is an enormous amount of square meters, there is a lot of public space in the compound, and there is kind of the idea to really concentrate the volume so that people are close to each other, they can find each other, and this process of making information, making media can really take its course. And then this, of course, one of the images most people know, kind of the loop type building with a clear facade, which has a pattern that feels weird to many. And then on the top, the Sky Studios and also the platform for helicopters to land on. This is the image of the TVCC building. I will not talk much about it here, but this is obviously a building that we had built. It was finished in 2008, and then at New Year's Eve, while the roof was not fully closed yet, fireworks were a bit too abundant fire around the building, and the building caught fire, and we after that had to rebuild the building. It has a hotel, it has the main studio as said before, and it has some accelerating functions to the loop building. And this is an image of the service building where, or the docking station as I like to refer to it, where these ends of trucks with all their information come back and exchange it with the production, and where actually the correspondents and people that work on the ground are hosted and find their services. If we look at the loop building, there's a lot of office space for the idea making, for the pre-production, for the production, and also for the post-production versus towards broadcasting, which is mainly hosted in the legs and in the upper part of the under part of the loop. In the top part is also where there are some offices, mainly related to the production managers and the lead management of the CCTV institution. Then there's a lot of special area that is also distributed all over the loop. In the base, we see many of the recording studios. In the loop itself, there are special moments where exchange happens between the different departments. And then in the upper part of the loop, we have the public loop inserted. We have the canteens and restaurants inserted, and we have also at the top the recording studios for the broadcasting of the news and special moments. There are in total 76 elevators, of which 8 are double-deckers, and they are feeding from the ground all the way up, but also within the loop on both the base part and the top part. There are separate elevators that bring people up in these areas, because still there are 20 floors to 30 floors to cover for the thing. The idea of the shape has also to do with the grandeur that we described before. There is a face of the building that stands up tallest, and that is seen from parts of the city where you also can really see the full loop, which is grandness. And then there is a leg of the building that is smaller and lower, and that is seen from the older part of the city, symbolizing the newness of the project. And here we come to the visitor loop, which was a very daring proposal. We also had to convince CCTV for a long time to keep it in. And it was to invite the public into the idea of media making and TV making. And you come in, you see part of the recording studios, you can peek in, you can go all the way up. Then you are in the underside, you see the production people, you see some of the production facilities. Then in the lower point, you can have an interaction with the garden through horizontal windows. And then you go through the post-production and the production stages so that you see all the elements of TV making through it. The public loop has been opened for a while. Currently it's closed because the type of regime in China has changed. But also the CCTV still has to get used to having that engagement with the public. It's still the idea to reopen it in the future. One of the biggest problems of this project was code compliance. If you look at kind of the things that we could fulfill was the height. We were not going through the height limit, and we were able to create a structure that could bend with the forces. But then all the other things, there were no codes in China that could describe what we were going to do. Then you can say two things. Okay, there are no codes to describe it, so you fulfill, and therefore you can do it. Or you can prove, or you have to prove that actually you can do it, although there is no code. And that was called the expert panels. We went through days and days of arguing with an enormous group of people that were engineers, professors in architecture, etc., to discuss our proposals and to validate our proposals. They would question the ideas and ask questions back to us. An unbelievable process of interaction, which many people can't imagine within the Chinese context, but it was actually gathering all the people that could have an opinion and talk about this, were given a voice and were helping us to synthesize the ideas. One of the most challenging parts was obviously the structure, because the towers are leaning. There's an enormous cantilever of 57 square meters, length meters. And what also kind of is very important in that aspect is that there were forces in the towers because of heat that were different between them. We worked with Arab in a very close collaboration. We do that in many projects still, and they came up with that structural system of the tube that of course supports the loop idea. And you see here this simply a base pattern and how that was transformed to a stress pattern that we would create. You see the corners were the highest point of stress. That's obviously because of the cantilever putting the pressure there. And then we translated that into a pattern that you see in the facade. So the facade pattern is a literal translation of the stress pattern that is in the structure and where there are beams. So the beams that are on the inside of the building are actually transcended outside through the facade and give the order or the structure in the facade, or the disorder, would you like. But you can read from the outside how the building actually stands and how it operates through it. To do that, we needed structure that was mainly located around these two moments of stress to capture the cantilever. And that was all completely calculated and put into stress diagrams to show. And you also see that the overhang performance was very, very important to simulate the deflection of it so that we could pre-bend most of the structure. And when it was joined, that it could take its final shape. Slowly and slowly, the more weight we added. To test all of this, we also built a model, which was very, very interesting to put it on an earthquake situation. This is a shaking table, and we were able to do all the tests. You see that it is a very big model. It's a 1:20 realistic model of the project, which was used for all kinds of testing, from structural testing to earthquake testing to also evacuation testing, etc., etc. A very interesting model that is still there. Key in the whole exercise was that we were able to build the towers independently, and then from there start cantilevering, and then only at the moment it was possible weather-wise, but also temperature-wise, so that the accumulated forces in the steel were equal between the two sides, join it. And that was done by a set of joints that still make the towers independent, but start working together in the deflection, as you just saw it before. And here you see one of these joints that was put in at a certain time, at a certain moment in temperature, so that the buildings could get joined and start working in a symbiosis, being still independent. The evacuation started in 2005. It took 2 years. An enormous amount of land had to be taken out to create the foundation. The foundation is partly a slab foundation and a pile foundation, and especially at the outside corners, reinforced raft slabs that take the overall load of the two towers. Then there was the weaving of the steel and making the concrete, an enormous, interesting, almost theater-like experience. And the deepest raft part was 30 meters under the soil. Also, there's a direct connection with a metro station that is underneath. This took about 6 years to complete. And then the steel was coming up. Very long pieces of steel that were prefabricated and then joined together on the site. And then the tower started climbing up. And you see that when we were climbing up, we already started making the support structure of the facade. And that also indicates the pattern that you see on the outside. And this is that famous moment of joining, kind of a very interesting exercise, because it was literally like this. Here I'm in a crane taking a picture of this scene, where joint by joint, day by day, when the conditions were right, the towers were actually joined through putting these joints in place. of course, this was a mega operation, so also the people working on the tower left their marks already before it was finished. And this was a poem that we found on one of the major steel columns by one of the people putting this in place, telling us what it has done for him to work on this project. And this is kind of how most people started to know about the building, namely during the Olympics in Beijing. The building was used as a background. The reporters were on the roof of a neighboring building looking at Beijing, and it became a symbol of the newness, as we just discussed during the Olympics. That also meant immediately that CCTV took the decision to revamp their Also, one of the things that happened was during that process, they started launching international channels so that other types of people that live in China also were able to receive news, but also another voice of the news was given to different regions in the world. Arabic channel, but also an American channel, African channel, European channel. So there were many different new ideas in the news making in the Chinese context. Now I will show you a few of the images of the inside. We unfortunately cannot show you much because it's quite confidential. But this is the entry point where the metro station and the underbelly of the project join. This is about 20 meters underground, where you see the main entry point from the parking garage and the ground floor of the metro line coming together, joining together, and then going up into the building. And this is the moment that you are at grade, where you immediately see that there is always a connection to the sky in every floor that you are. And this is the point where also there is the main entry point with the rolling doors coming in. And here you see an angle where that underground, you see the escalators coming up, where that underground actually comes into the belly, and where that central entry point of the building happens, and where daylight is brought in by the difference in angle. And here you see a view from the infrastructural hallway where the recording studios are. So these two stone elements are the recording studios. They have a different materiality so that they are clearly recognizable. And you look back into the central lobby of the CCTV complex so that you also immediately are confronted with that idea of media and TV making. And this is that hallway that I just, between the two studios, took the picture of. And here you see the studio's entry points. And you see that daylight again behind the facade, and the entry points of the studios recessed because they of course need to be box in box so that there's no daylight penetration and good acoustical surroundings. There are also a lot of restaurants and almost village-like things happening in the building because there's an enormous amount of staff working there and also during the night because the news never stops, but also production never stops. So there are restaurants and bars and even supermarkets in the project where the staff is getting their food, where they are entertained, and also where they can get their groceries before they go home. And this is the only image that we can make public of the real center of the center of the center, namely, this is where the broadcasting system is. And you see all the different channels of CCTV have a screen. You see supervisors putting the screens up and broadcasting up. You see supervisors of the supervisors looking at the main channels, and then you see the center where there is the central control room from where the ideas of control in the media happen, and this is exactly mirrored on the other side. So you can imagine how many how much information and how many stations are managed from this one control room, really the brain of the building, you could say. I told you there is a public loop. This is that underbelly of the overhang where you could go through. This is when like this, like the full loop with the full opening, which is obviously pretty iconic, and also with all the satellite discs on the top for the broadcasting. But sometimes the building, although it is this gigantic, also simply disappears within the city and its surroundings, or it looks very fragile almost and very singular, rather than that you can oversee this full loop. This is, for example, from the third ring road. You can almost not read this full loop shape idea. At night, it also really comes to life. I said it is a building that is 24/7. So the lights, of course, give it a life. And you then also start reading this pattern even better because it becomes the negative of the facade. And here we are underneath the loop, where we look back to these windows that you also just saw, and you can see the whole loop of the TV making, and you can also see the different stresses in the facade that give the different segmentations of the image. And here a closer look up, what you see is that the steel structure next to it is doubled, and that steel structure becomes the supporting structure for the facade that is then in pockets filled in with this regular window, and there where the steel cuts through, the window is simply cut. And here you see another zoom up of that pattern, and you see also how diverse it is, and also how it is not always one directional. It sometimes also goes with different segments because of the stress. Here you see an image from the other side where you see that the interaction with the city and the context, although it is such a big building, sometimes also really happens because of the big opening, and it is not one solid mass. It really becomes readable in elements as part of the city. And here you see another of these images where it only presents its top. And here, again, a night shot where you see that during the night, it becomes almost a mysterious shape. And here from one of the hutongs of Beijing, an image where you see that the opening almost disappears and it becomes almost two towers that are next to each other. So again, a very different and almost fragile point of view. And this is an image from the Forbidden City, more or less the old center of the center, where you also read the difference between the typical skyscraper who is just reaching for the sky, and you can still see the loop shape of this building connecting back to the earth, you could say, coming up, going around and connecting back. The building got the nickname the Big Pants because it obviously has two legs and then a joint part. It's always interesting that within the Chinese context, buildings get nicknames. The Shenzhen Stock Exchange, for example, is called the mini skirt. It always gets something out of real life. And that means that people can also comment on it in a very subtle way, sometimes extremely positive, sometimes a bit alien or more negative, which is a nice way of introducing criticism in the society to some of the structures that help build the new China. And then in the outside, in the rest of the world, it also gets noticed, not only within the Chinese context. For example, this was a cartoon which we thought was very, very funny, where suddenly our project started appearing as a project of a student, probably in a creative class or an architectural class, where kind of we really think it's interesting that it becomes part of culture beyond the situation and its context, but that it starts taking a position and a recognition point for the culture it represents. And that is what I had prepared for you around the Beijing CCTV building.
Thank you very much, David. It's been a real pleasure to hear your elaboration of the project, showing us so much that just isn't published. And I'll shift directly to introduce next to me Anthony Dalto and Vincenzo Orologia, who will conduct the interview.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anthony Dalto, and my partner in this interview is Vincenzo Orologia. And we would like to thank you for your fantastic presentation of the CCTV project. Amongst others at OMA, we thank you also for this unique opportunity to interview. Office of Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, was launched, as the name of the office has always implied, with an emphasis on metropolitan urban architecture. The CCTV project aims for the reinvention of the tower typology, proposing an alternative. In the published works of Rem Koolhaas, perhaps the most preeminent theorist of the 20th century skyscraper, the CCTV promised to kill the skyscraper and the repetitive banality of towers, which race only to be taller. This particular agenda is familiar across the history of OMA's instrumentality of diagrammatic generative processes, establishing project strategies as organizational diagrams encapsulating clear ideas and intentions. OMA's diagrams embody and ebb critically and commentary, and they have often served as provocations. In addition, the use of blue foam study models within the design studio environment at OMA has been one of the office's preferred 3D media with which to develop a proliferate project diagrams. Can you share with us how the loop emerged as an idea of the Boolean tetrahedron in early design stages as the agent to subvert the two-dimensionality of discrete towers?
Obviously, I was not present at OMA at the time, so I can only translate what was told to me when I took over the building in 2008, or the building process. The main idea, we tested all kinds of models, not only through blue foam, but also kind of in mass modeling. And we really had the feeling that we would disconnect when we would go to the three-tower scheme as they had proposed in the master plan. And therefore, you would have a broadcasting section, a production section, and maybe a management section, which we thought would not enhance the transparency of media or the transparency of information, because then everybody would have its own position. And we thought it would be very interesting to combine these positions and therefore create an atmosphere where everybody could learn from each other, but also everybody could understand its point of view in a very complex context within the Chinese regime and the Chinese culture. And therefore, we really were only looking for models that were combined. And obviously, when we studied the loop of TV making, the idea of the loop emerged quite quickly. We did many studies of a loop, first in 2 dimensions, so not also breaking out and cantilevering, but more as a real circle or as a square. And then when we kind of started looking at how we could interact with the ring road, but also with more fragile parts of the city that have smaller dimensions, we started pulling out that massing model leading to this way of doing the loop. I would say that it probably was in the 4th or 5th week of the competition, which lasted for about 3 months.
Were there other diagrams than this particular typology of the loop, which were considered in early design stages?
Yeah, many. but they have all also been in exhibitions. There were many different types of ideas, which is a kind of a working style of our office. We never take anything for granted. We test and test and test and test, and then only when we are certain, we pick. So that is, there are many different studies, from a 3-tower model to a 1-tower model, to a cube type of model, to a loop in the 2 dimensions as described, and then the 3-dimensional. And when that's submerged, we choose for it quite quickly and only develop that. But that led still to probably another 60 to 70 models of how that could be done.
The CCTV project had broken many rules and conventions, formal, typological, contextual expectations, as well as statutory rules about controlling architectural production. The building did not comply with the rigid Chinese building codes and planning guidelines at the time it was designed and constructed, but the proposal was seemingly negotiated and accepted to comply with the building regulations and planning conventions. As an innovative, unique, and striking design, the CCTV project had quickly become a symbol of Beijing. Deferring for a moment from the notion of building as a landmark, the politics of iconography, the figure of CCTV continually changes the perception and reading of its form, always identifiable from a great distance as a landmark. As an icon of Beijing, what did you find to be the most significant aspect of the building in terms of the public exposure and context of CCTV?
I think what was really striking to it is that it became an image or an icon quite quickly, because people started to relate to it, not because it's the highest or not because it's the most color red, but they started relating to the shape and the understanding of the shape. And so that's also why I said the big pens was a compliment for us, because it really related back to all day culture of the city. So I think people recognized what we were trying to do, not always liking it, but definitely understanding that we were trying to do something very different. And I think that helped also to make it an image or an icon. We never like to talk about icons as architects, because if you have a collection of icons, nothing is an icon anymore. So we really try to create a building that is unique and that kind of transcends the institution or the process that is happening within. And I think that was a striking example of it.
Can you share with us how you see the landmark status of CCTV? Is it recognizable based on its unusualness and its eventual recognizability and familiarity?
I think it's definitely recognizable because of its curious shape. And when you start looking at it and trying to understand it, you probably start understanding more of the meaning and the engagement with the surroundings and the context. And as I said, described it before, it goes from very bombastic and iconic to very fragile and singular, which I think is a part of the myth around the building, that it is never the same from whatever angle you see it, which also helps in that kind of idea of being unique.
Also, back to breaking rules. Has the building had an impact on the changing of building codes in China and planning regulations within Beijing?
Yes, it did. Especially the earthquake testing and the structural simulation flew off after that for other projects.
Designed in collaboration with the engineer Cecil Baumann at Europe, the diagrid mapped onto the skin of CCTV acts as a megatube. Unnecessary and redundant elements were removed to resolve the eccentric forces of the 6-degree slopes of the extrusions, seismic and wind forces, and the 75-meter cantilever of the administration block. While working with Europe, were other options for other structural principles considered?
No.
Okay.
Simply because the tube would also really relate a lot to the loop, so that we have spaces within the tube that were as free as possible. And also the skin, we wanted to translate the skin directly from the structure to show how it actually operates. So therefore, we really wanted the structure on the outside. So we always worked on that idea of the tube that was going to be folded. And that's also what you see.
What unique challenges led to the final architectural and engineering design, since you had the idea to start off from the beginning with having the structure be expressed?
Yeah, that's a very complex question, because that obviously there's in such a project with such a magnitude, there are many decisions that are crucial to in the end realize it. I think one of the biggest decisions was that when we finally sat on the loop and sat on the pushed shape, was to maintain that, because all the forces were of course against that, because it's much simpler to make a window, it's much simpler to make two towers. So we always had to resist referring back to things that people already knew, because this was something people didn't know. So when we took the decision to go for it, we rigorously kept that original diagram of the building, as you like, as the starting point of everything. And I think that was a crucial decision, because if we would have given in or make a compromise to that, then the building would have transformed back to something that people would not see as unique anymore, or that would become a compromise. Its rigor in preserving that was important, even when we had to rebuild part of the complex, or even when we had to do the interior design, which came much later. Obviously, we done also the full interior design of the building. We keep that rigor in place, and we never compromised to it in any way. So I think that is probably the most important thing for us as architects to live by, in this case.
In our Masters of Architecture graduate semester, Beyond the Envelope, we analyze each project across 6 different themes. One of these themes is identity, which entails what architecture community communicates and how the building performs contextually. CCTV stages visual effects on the skyline of Beijing. It is perceived as translucent from some angles and opaque from other orientations. The building is quoted in publications to blend in with the notoriously polluted skies of Beijing, also designed not to look like a dirty glass facade. How is this principle of the hazy skies of Beijing tested? Did OMA do renderings or color reflection simulations?
We built mock-ups. As you saw, we did a 1:20 structural model, but we also built mock-ups of the facade. And we obviously tested that in a coloring situation, not only at ground, but also at height, so that we could see how it would behave under an angle and how it would behave in a hazy sky, how it would behave in a bright sky. And what you see is that the building turns more to the brown colors when there is sunshine, and it turns more into the grayish, bluish colors with the idea of clouds and haze. So it responds, or it at least captures some of its surrounding qualities of the air, and therefore it sometimes disappears and sometimes it appears very dominantly. So yes, we did a lot of testing, but especially on real material at grade and at height.
So in your view, were the desired and predicted effects accomplished in the built outcome of CCTV?
In general, yes, but as an architect, you always see things that you would do differently if you had a second chance. But that luxury is almost never there, only when you restore your own buildings. But no, I think we are very satisfied with that part of the outcome. Yes.
We would like to now pivot to a discussion of the politics of architecture. Great architecture provokes people to think, reflect, and ultimately has the power to impact, to change society. Architecture which strives for correctness and appropriateness often fails this ambition. The status of the CCTV building as a landmark and also as an architectural icon substantiates its cultural value and meaning on many levels. In spite of being known by all of Beijing and much loved, the building had grown to be deemed controversial within China. Can you share with us a historical account of the initial and eventual reception of the CCTV project? How and why the CCTV building had gradually become mired in controversy by the professional communities of architects and engineers in China, the Chinese public, and eventually by the president of China?
So when you build a project of this scale, obviously the reception has different voices. It has a voice of locality. It has a voice on the city or the metropolis level. It has a voice on the country level, and it has an Asian context, and it has the worldwide premises. The reception of it was in the beginning curious and subtle, and trying to understand what we try to achieve. I think still, when you see, we teach, for example, at CAFA, one of the schools in Beijing, you still see when the students and also the professors study the building, there's always the part that they really like about it. And there are also things that they see as from another era when China was upcoming and didn't have its own identity yet. Of course, the current president made statements about weird buildings, and CCTV was put under that idea of weird buildings, which never was supported by the intellectual part of architecture within the Chinese context or within the Asian context. It was picked up a lot in the international media because it came for the international media, of course, as a God's gift that they could criticize architects that would work in China and would try to achieve something in the Chinese context, because that's still seen as a complex and maybe even an how do you say, aggressive context to work within. From an architecture point of view, that is quietly, for us at least, very, very different. We engage also with contexts that are not necessarily completely compliant with the Western idea of how a society should be. We try to learn from that and try to investigate it and also see what a contextual response within that could be to bring progress, even very little progress. And for us, it was already kind of a great idea that the media suddenly was in the part of the city, so everybody could view it. Yeah, it was not secret somewhere outside anymore. Then adding something as a public loop was already, although it's now closed again, we hope that it opens up again. It creates this kind of engagement that was never possible or never there. It's very small steps, but within the perception of the Chinese culture, they of course become larger or aspiring in one way. And also that is recognized when you see the studies about the building or the writing. And the building, of course, because of its shape, got a response in nicknames, but also a response in art. You see many photographers, but also many artists actually responding to the shape and responding to its signature skin, you could say. And it also became, because of that, iconic, not necessarily only because of its building, but also the interpretation of it. There was a whole exhibition about it in Beijing also, where all the art that related to CCTV was on show. So yes, it is a project of Rising China, it's a project of media, and maybe some people argue dominance, but it's also a project of opening up, engaging, and putting things that are in society or for society in society. So it's too complex to say this is how it evolved, because it's not one voice. There are different voices around it. But we are still lecturing about it, as you see today. But we are also asked a lot about the ideas and what it actually did. We're also not gone. We are still communicating with CCTV because the in-housing is still ongoing. But the project, to our opinion, is a successful project for what we were asked to do.
CCTV had become a symbol of China's globalization and internationality. Do you believe a project like CCTV, designed by a Western architect, can be commissioned within the cultural and political context of China today?
Not alone. It will always, then it was possible as for a foreign architect to do that alone. I think now that would always be in symbiosis with a Chinese architect. But we're still working in China quite significantly in our portfolio. And we keep engaging with that context because we think it's important to have that exchange. It's part of our profession. It's a part of the world that rises quickly and that is also developing heavily. So that communication and learning curve on both sides is for us an important reason to keep engaging with it.
If you were commissioned a project for the headquarters of CCTV in 2023, more than 20 years after your initial commission, how might your decisions concerning the unusualness of the building's form be approached differently today?
That's impossible to answer because that's a different process in a different context with different leaders, with different. So that's really kind of redoing it, and probably the outcome would be very different, but it's impossible to say what we would do differently because it's a total different context and idea. The world has changed since then.
Our next question concerns the relationships of CCTV project to the larger body of work of OMA. Characterized by the use of diagrammatic strategies, OMA has positioned architectural practices as a form of critical commentary on disciplinary spatial issues, political, economic, social, cultural conditions of the context of work. Across countless OMA projects, interest in uncertainty, unexpectedness, and criticality are evident. Further to your presentation, can you share with us the genealogy of the design of CCTV project within OMA?
Yeah, it's obviously a very important project within our portfolio, not only because we were reaching out to China, a space where we didn't work yet, but also within developing the diagrammatic language of criticism or critique, you could say, of striving for new models and new ideas, which is always an evolution. So like Porto is an evolution of a concept, like Taipei Performing Arts Center now is an evolution of concept that will then be followed up by the project in Manchester, the factory. So it's a constant evolution of ideas that continues, and that is our rethought and we rethink. So within the office portfolio of OMA, CCTV has an important role to play because it shows that you can do things differently in a very logic way with a very unique and unexpected outcome, as long as you question the question that you receive. And that is obviously its main contribution to the portfolio, to take nothing for granted and to be rigorous. So the position of it is very important. It's one of our important buildings in the portfolio that really started a new thinking process about offices in other contexts as well.
Within OMA, are there projects which led to CCTV diagrammatically and spatially?
No.
No.
It was really a process that we started from scratch, and that led to something afterwards, but before there was nothing.
CCTV was proposed 21 years ago and completed 11 years ago. We are interested in the consequences of this project on the portfolio of work at OMA in the last decade or so. Further to your presentation, can you share with us how you see the influence of the CCTV project upon the work of OMA since its design and completed construction?
I think after the completion of CCTV, we could really say that we were working in all regions of the world: the Americas, Europe, Middle East and Africa, and Asia and Australia. So in that sense, it was really important to complete the puzzle of the global reach. Secondly, as I said before, it really led to rethinking the type of office, not the standard that developers would bring, but because it was for an institution, we could really rethink how people work together and live together while they're working. And that type of thinking we took forward, which is very visible, for example, in the Springer building that we delivered 10 years later, but also in the Tencent headquarter building that we delivered together with Biat in the same city, which is a total different puzzle, but there are a lot of learnings from the CCTV building also in that building, which is in the same context, the Chinese context, even the same city, just one ring road further. So it led to thinking on a typology that went far beyond brief.
This interview and the study of the set of projects in the Beyond the Envelope series of presentations and interviews are set within the Master of Architecture course here at NYIT. As such, the audience of this event and this interview is the future of architecture. In this context, can you please share with us, from your point of view, any advice you may have for the next generation of architects?
I have 2 points of advice. Firstly, our profession is really a privilege because you're in the center pivot point of many discussions. You can have an impact in a built form, but you also can have a social impact and an economic impact. So be very curious to explore all the dimensions and not do one-dimensional architecture in the sense of just putting bricks together or steel and glass together, but really think about beyond that, about the consequences it has what you do. Second thing is architecture is sometimes taken extremely serious, which it also is as an outcome. But I would really recommend you to have a lot of joy and fun doing it, because we are so privileged of being able to be involved in it. It's not only about seriousness and hard work, it's also about fun and understanding what you're actually doing within a certain context, and that enriches your own personality and context too. So also enjoy it and have fun. And I think that is a very important thing. Maybe lastly, don't dive into the computer constantly, because it's actually happening in the real world. Technology is only there to support us, but it's not the tool. The tool is your brain and what you observe with that brain.
Great. Thank you very much for the unique opportunity to interview you today.
You're welcome. It was fun.
Thank you very much, David, for your insightful presentation and really for the generosity to join us for the interview as well. With you as managing partner architect at OMA in the headquarters in Rotterdam, we look forward to years of output and new projects that OMA will please us with. So thank you. Really appreciate it. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.